So my name is Andy Maluzzi. I'm president of DMR Amateur Radio Club, and recently we actually installed a DMR, which stands for Digital Mobile Radio here in Gainesville. It's a form of digital voice. So this presentation will give you some background on digital voice protocols, and then go into DMR in some great detail. So digital voice. What do we think of when we think of digital voice? Well, we sort of know what analog signals are, right? You have your amplitude modulation, and then you also have your frequency modulation. Those are sort of the two most common derivatives of communication in amateur radio. FM's common in your HTs. AM, or its derivative, single sideband, is very common on HF. Digital voice is basically capturing that analog sound, what you're hearing right now, that baseband sound, running it through a processor, and then forming a sort of digital packet to send that information out, essentially as binary values. So what does that system sort of look like? Well, you might be talking into your microphone, into your HT, into your radio, and there's a processor in there that actually receives that signal. In an analog system, it would just go straight through an analog circuitry and out the other end. But in this side, there's a processor that'll receive it. It's going to convert it into a whole bunch of binary values, into some sort of packet with some sort of information about it, and then it would send that out over RF. So there's a few common standards for RF around. The first one is DStar, Digital Smart Technologies for Amateur Radio. It is the only amateur radio specific one out there, and it's got a whole bunch of features really geared around amateur radio. The sort of new one that everyone's talking about is Yaesu System Fusion, and that's mainly due to those cheap repeaters. Yep?
Isn't that plain old C4FM?
No, and I'll get to that in a second. Then there's Digital Mobile Radio, which is actually an open commercial standard that's been heavily adopted in amateur radio. And then the last one is P25 and NXDN. Those are less common in amateur radio, but still very, very similar and useful for digital voice. They're 95% similar and 100% different. I think I saw this in a Dayton talk and thought it was a great quote to sort of explain this. These technologies are wonderful in the sense that they are all built on a lot of the same technology, but everyone sort of implemented their own little requirements around them, and that's sort of a problem. They are all open standards. Yeah?
Any way we can get the second screen turned on, because he's standing right in front.
Oh, I will take a step back.
Well, if you can push the button, maybe, but I don't know. We can't get it to turn on.
I don't know how to.
Yeah,
Well, I'll scoot down as far as I can, but.
We got plenty of seats over here.
I know, but you're not walking with a cane and bad knees.
maybe, I don't know what it does for your recording, but if you stood there.
I can stand on either side, that's not a big deal, but if I'm.
That's fine.
Okay, I'll stay back here. So we'll first quickly dive into DStar. So this open standard has been around the longest for amateur radio and is heavily adopted by ICOM and Kenwood. So what is DStar? It's a Gaussian mean shift keying. Probably way over the head of most people in here. Essentially what this means is your signal operates around the I and Q circle, the real and imaginary circle. When you send out a digital wave, it's not that beautiful sinusoid like you think it is. It's more like a helix. And if we can stay along that circle, we get a very, very efficient signal. So that's sort of the benefit, and what a lot of these digital modes are based off of is we can control how the signal goes out, therefore we can make it stay on the circle, and it's really, really clean and much more efficient for battery life. Yes?
Is this the Gauss that invented integral calculus, or something to do with that?
It's named after him, not because of the keying. The reason why it's called the Gaussian mean shift keying is because the first step of it is running through a Gaussian filter. And then you go into your MSK. But really, it's a frequency shift keying. So in this mode, you're basically oscillating between two frequencies, and that basically says if it's a 0 or a 1. And those two frequencies were chosen such that they lie on that circle. And you can sort of see the 4 of them there, because every frequency have like sort of a conjugate. It's very, very similar to PSK in the sense that you have a continuous phase shift when you go between these. So you don't have any abrupt changes. Again, that's what makes it efficient. That means we can have much, much more narrow bandwidth with this, 6.25 kilohertz, and still achieve a relatively fast 48 baud. DStar spec does go faster than 48 baud, but in the scope of digital voice, the spec caps out at 48 baud. If you go up to 1.2 gig, you can get up to like 56K modem speeds. It is an open packet definition, and like I said, it has been adapted. by 2 manufacturers. And one of the cool things, well, one of the disadvantages of it, I guess, is that it does not have forward error correction. All of the packet is sent spending, moving your voice back and forth. So what does that mean when you go to operate? Well, because it was designed for hams, you can sort of, identify digitally. You enter it into your radio when you first get it, and that sort of sends your call sign with every packet. It uses actually a closed source vocoder. A vocoder basically means that when you talk on any of these digital modes, you are not hearing the other person. You're hearing a computer's approximation of the other person. So this takes what our speech sounds like and says, this is what an ah sounds like, codes that with some numbers, adds some additional things to sort of say how fast you said it, what volume you said it at, those sorts of things to add inflection, and then sends it out as a digital packet. DStar also introduced this concept of networked repeaters around the world. So we have networked repeaters that will more or less, you log into a reflector that sort of acts like a chat room, and from that reflector, you can talk to people all over. The only downside is you can only have one active reflector on a repeater at a time. So if I want to talk to someone on DStar and Bob wants to talk to someone else in a different room, or a different reflector, we'd actually be sort of fighting with each other to do that. Again, it's one user sort of, now if we all want to operate within that same reflector, everything's hunky-dory, and there's no problems there. You can also think of it as voice and data are the same traffic as far as the repeaters are concerned, so this makes it really extensible. We can build upon this, and that's sort of what a lot of the Aries stuff around DStar's happened, is building upon this concept that everything is sort of data. There's no concept of really voice when the machines actually think of it. But it is one frequency, thus one transmitting user on a repeater at a time. More recently, we saw Yaesu System Fusion. This technology that everyone seems to call C4FM stands for Constant Envelope 4-Level Frequency Shift Modulation. It's a 4-level frequency shift keying, so it's still FSK, just like the core of the GMSK of DStar, just it's 4 levels. And it has a constant amplitude. So if you look at the constellation there, you can see now there are 8 points on the constellation instead of 4, as we move between different signals to convey 2 bits. Now, what that enables us to do is requires a little bit more bandwidth, but gives us a lot more capabilities in terms of transmitting a signal. And you can now transmit 9600 baud. Again, it's an open packet definition, and this does have forward error correction in its full sort of packet width. It can do data as well. However, the spec is not complete. It does contradict itself, sort of like the repeaters and stuff, and it's not really a fully mature, despite being out for about 2 years now, it's not really a fully mature digital voice solution yet. Hopefully Yaesu will get on this. You can go online and read endless rants about Yaesu System Fusion and all the problems it's had. Their networking system is somewhat kludgy. You can't do it directly from a repeater like you can with DStar now. So it isn't quite there yet, but it is another ham-specific technology that will hopefully gain traction and get a community behind it. How do you operate? Again, you get to enter your call sign into the radio. Again, it's designed by hams. This one uses the newer AMBI2 vocoder. So it's got a little bit better in terms of approximating. Voice is going to sound a little better than DStar. And you have networked repeaters that very much act in the same way. You have rooms, and you would log into the room if you have the wires 200 sort of HSI 200 interface, and you'd log into a room and everyone could talk, essentially just as how DStar works. What's really made System Fusion popular was that Yaesu gave away their repeaters for $500, and every ham, being as frugal as we are, decided to jump on that inexpensive opportunity. There's been some bugs along the way and some growing pains, but it's really sort of gotten the system out there. Now we get into digital mobile radio. This is by far the most widely manufactured and therefore the cheapest solution out there. A System Fusion or a DStar radio is going to cost you about $300. You can get actually I have it sitting on the table there, my Titera MD380 for $120 to my front door. So much cheaper to get into DMR. It's made by Motorola Solutions, is the big people in the US backing it with their product called Moto Turbo. Hytera is a Chinese competitor, as is Titera. Connect Systems is another one, and Vertex Standard, which is the professional arm of Yaesu. So if you, ironically enough, Yaesu has been making DMR radios much longer than they've been doing System Fusion. The sort of professional sort of commercial grade radios are the Motorola Solutions, the Hytera, and the Vertex Standard radios. The other ones are more targeted at the more inexpensive market. So what's really cool about DMR is that it's TDMA. time division multiple access. That means you can have two completely independent conversations going on the repeater at the same time. So if I was to key up the repeater from here, I can't quite do it in this room. I can do it from outside, but I can't do it from in here. I could be talking just fine, and David Fox at N4DF could be talking to someone else on a different time slot completely. So that's really cool because it essentially gives you a free repeater. It's 2 repeaters for the price of 1. This uses 4-level frequency shift keying. Doesn't that sound familiar? Essentially, this is C4FM, and it's the same concept that's also used in P25 and NXDN. So by Yaesu branding themselves as C4FM, it's a nice sort of shortcut of saying system fusion, but really it's the underlying modulation that's quite common in this sort of space. Again, it's 12.5 kilohertz of bandwidth, 9600 baud signals, and it is an open commercial standard as defined by ETSI, which is a European Standards Institute. So it is open and implemented and maintained by a sort of third-party agency. So very, very well documented and all that. And it does have forward error correction, which is good for when you start dropping packets. You don't notice it as much. Yes?
Does DMR require registration with DStar then?
We'll be getting to that on the next slide. Actually, the slide after this. So the way TDMA works is essentially, and the way DStar's implemented it, is we've made a whole bunch of 30 millisecond time chunks. We're going to transmit for about 27 and a half of those milliseconds and then use the other time for actually the synchronization due to the speed of light. You can only get about 50 miles of range out of a DMR repeater because of the speed of light. But essentially someone would use it and they would be talking, 2 people could be using it, 1 person on time slot 1, 1 person on time slot 2, and the voice would come through pretty much as you would know. Your radio is actually oscillating very quickly between transmit and receive. And it's also oscillating very quickly in terms of processing the audio. It's either storing it or it's actively processing it to send it out. So they're quite powerful little radios and repeaters that do this system. Here we go. So it does require you to register with a number. DMR being a commercial standard, it doesn't have this concept of call sign. It has an identification number for each radio. DMR Mark, that's the DMR club at Motorola Solutions. Motorola Amateur Radio Club is Mark. They sort of have the master database that you're supposed to register in. It takes about 10 minutes or 24 hours depending on the load to register your call sign, and you'll be given a number that's based on your location. So Florida, our zone is 3112, so it's going to be 3112 plus some number after that. So I'm 3112, I think 746. So I'm the 746th person in the state of Florida to register a DMR number. So you have to do that before you can get on the system. You can receive till your heart's content, but you can't transmit. The reason why is if my number matches someone else's number, when you do a personal call, it won't know who's routing that. This does not satisfy the FCC requirement for identification. You still have to identify by voice to meet that requirement, unlike some of the other technologies. Audio is digitizing the AMBI2 vocoder. So same sort of concept there, system fusion. But we have a couple of different networks for our networked repeaters, and I'm going to dig a lot more into this because this is what's really cool. The 2 big networks are Brandmeister, which is a completely open, will accept any repeater, will accept the DV4 minis, and then DMR Mark actually runs a big one with several partner networks across the nation. And our local Gainesville repeater is part of the DMR Mark network, although there is a bridge talk group to Brandmeister. You must program your radio prior to use. They do not have a user programmable interface. You have to use their customer programming software. Again, it's a commercial standard. You have to build what's called a code plug and go from there. So we'll dig into that in a second. So first, how do we use DMR network-wise? So we have these concepts of talk groups. It's not like you have to log into a chat room. It's very different in that respect because think about a commercial company. They don't want their employees constantly saying, oh, which one should I be in? They want to be transmitting this all the time. So your talk groups are pretty much broken up into a couple of different ways. You have your radio designed to listen to one or multiple talk groups, and they're all being transmitted potentially at the same time on both time slots, depending on how your repeater's configured. So you will select in your radio when you program it what talk groups you want it to listen to. So I might say channel 1, I want to listen to worldwide, and it will ignore all other talk groups, but will just listen to worldwide. There are several that are passed, and I'll go over that in a few minutes, but most of them are push to talk. So you don't have to log in, but if you turn your radio to the worldwide and you push to talk, it will key up that repeater for worldwide for the next 15 minutes or so, and all the other repeaters that are keyed up for worldwide will ring live. The reason why this is sort of a feature rather than a deterrent, there's over 2,000 DMR repeaters around the world. If everyone was to key up worldwide and have that constantly broadcasting, that sort of runs into the issue of consuming a whole bunch of bandwidth and time slots. So this is a way to sort of control, if you really want your local repeater to be hearing this. Your repeater operator can select if they want to change this or not. So I've been talking about these networks. Brandmeister is sort of the open network. That's actually the DV4 Mini. It can do DMR, P25, DStar, System Fusion, all that. It's a little UHF transceiver that you plug in over USB. DMR is mainly a UHF technology, mainly because that's where commercial radios are, but there are VHF and 900 megahertz DMR rigs available. And Brandmeister, like I said, is sort of the open network that everyone can join. DMR Mark is sort of limited to the Motorola repeaters. It uses the Motorola IP Site Connect as its back end and this concept of what's called a C-bridge to sort of expand it. And C-bridge is basically a computer that tricks IP Site Connect into allowing more people on board. And you have several smaller network partners. So the one that's local for us that our repeater's on is the K4USD network. And they're actually based out of Atlanta, but that's what we're on. So when you talk to our repeater, it sends all that traffic up to Atlanta, and then Atlanta sends it to the appropriate network. Some talk groups are managed by different networks. So a lot of it's managed by DMR Mark, and it will talk to DMR Mark Core, but some of the other ones are managed by other companies that will go accordingly. So I've talked about our repeater here. So Gator Amateur Radio Club operates the W4DFU DMR repeater. It is on 444.8125 megahertz, a standard split of plus 5 megahertz. It has a color code of 1. Color codes are sort of like PL tones for DMR repeaters. Time slot 1 has these among many more. You can go to k4usd.org to see everything that it passes. But these are the common ones. We have Worldwide, which is hosted by DMR Mark, and it's push to talk. Worldwide English. There's also Worldwide Spanish, Nordic, a few others. And that's push to talk as well. North America, which is always on. So you will pretty much always hear activity on talk group 3 on our repeater. And then the next one is time slot 2. We'll have more of the local stuff. So it has the southeastern region, the ARL southeastern region. It'll have the Florida state. It has First Coast, which is actually a sub-network that's based out of Jacksonville. And then our local repeater as well. So just so you don't hit the rest of the network, you just hit what we're talking about here. It's currently located at Shands Hospital in the North Tower. It is on emergency power. The antenna is up about 200 feet in the air. It has pretty good coverage. The antenna actually got moved last night, so it has really good coverage now compared to what it was before. We had people checking in from Williston earlier. So in terms of radios, the most popular out there and what really made the explosion in DMR is the MD380. It is an inexpensive radio, about $120 shipped to your front door. There's lots of available code plugs. We actually have one available on the Gator website that you can go to and actually download. So all you have to do is enter in your call sign and then program your radio, and it's got a lot of the stuff already done for you. If you like the way that I lay out the radio. If you don't, you are welcome to go in there and change it. The Connect System 750 is sort of the other big competitor. It's a slightly higher caliber radio, retails for over $200. The main difference between these two is the Connect Systems is Part 90 accepted, as where the Titera is not. So what you're paying for is that acceptance. You're going to have the guaranteed better oscillator and that sort of thing in there. Again, this sort of goes back to the original days of amateur radio, modifying commercial stuff to really meet our needs. Hytera is a really high-end sort of competitor to Motorola. Of course, you have Motorola. You can identify their radios with an XPR followed by 4 digits. And they actually have some really cool radios that do look like regular radios, but you also have like the cell phone style ones. Again, you're sort of making a GSM cell phone network in the sense with DMR, with the TDMA and all that. So like for instance, Disney is standardized on DMR, and you'll see a lot of people walking around Disney with the little cell phone shaped ones. Vertex Standard would be the other one that's commercially done, and that again is Yaesu. When you get to mobile radios, by far the most popular is the Connect Systems 800. That's about upper $200 range. The Motorola XPR radios, you're talking $1,000-ish. I actually have my brother's Motorola on loan in my car. I love the thing to death. It's built like a tank. And again, they're notified by their XPRs. Yeah.
Which model have you got?
I have the 4550. So the 4550 is their 50 watt, I want to say, DMR or analog radio, and it has like 1,000 channels of memory and all that. So. No, I mean the prefix is XPR. Yeah, so that's how you can sort of identify a DMR radio for Motorola. They do have several different frequency ranges for these as well, so if you do purchase one, do pay attention with all these companies as to what frequency range you get. There is one that includes the ham bands, there's ones that don't. Yes?
What made amateur radio adopt DMR radio?
Really the two-slot, the TDMA approach, because it really creates 2 repeaters for the price of one, and the inexpensive radios. So it sort of made digital voice much more accessible for amateur radio. So
That doesn't work over the internet, right?
I can talk to people. I mean, it has an internet backbone, you know. Yeah, and that's how you talk around the world. Hytera makes one for your car, but what's really cool is what's coming soon. So Hytera is coming out with one. No price on that. The one though that everyone's sort of talking about was a big deal at Dayton this year was the DV4 Mini. So if you remember that DV4 dongle I talked about earlier, this thing has LTE, it has DStar, DMR, System Fusion, P25, NXDN, Wi-Fi. It's pretty much got everything in it. It's sort of the bee's knees in terms of radio. It's about $1,200 is what they're saying the retail price is going to be in terms of ballpark. And we haven't actually seen one working yet, but you know, that's sort of what's cool. It's got like several software-defined radios in there. It can do both VHF and UHF, and I guess 220 as well. So really going to be a cool platform if it makes it to market. So I talked about programming. You make what's called a code plug, and be warned that the programming software can be very difficult to use. It's not designed to be used frequently. So being a ham and updating it constantly as you want to add more stuff really is not the use case. Each vendor sort of has their own software, so you can't just say, oh, I learned one, I can program a Motorola because I know how to program my Hytera. Having both radios, I can tell you they are completely different. And they can be very, very complex to create these. You have to be able to really leverage online resources or download one and just use their simple, you need to change these things to work on your radio. There is lots of tutorials online. I would highly suggest you check out the Amateur Radio Reddit or YouTube. There's lots of great examples on how to do that. And you can usually create one in a few minutes, but to really make one that's going to probably meet your needs, you're going to spend a few hours. And I'm constantly tweaking mine, adding new things, and periodically updating my radio. So when you program these radios, you have to add a few things. The first one is your contacts. And your contacts are both talk groups as well as other people's radios. Because you identify as a number, if I was to call Bob, I would not know that it's Bob. I would just see his number flash across the screen. I can make it so I can see Bob's name and his call sign. The other thing that's nice is I can actually give a private call to Bob over DMR. It's one of the very cool things that it offers. So I could just call his radio directly, or it's going to wake up any radio with Bob's identification number, but I could call that radio directly and talk to him. So that's sort of cool. You need to create a zone. Zones typically have 16 or 32 channels. They are typically one zone per repeater. And this is sort of how you organize your radio. Again, this is coming from the commercial world, where you have this concept of, you know, if you're driving a truck or something, it might be a city that is your zone, or it might be a company that is your zone. This we sort of, in amateur radio world, have set up as our repeaters. And as I said, you have channels that contain frequency, time slot, your color code, and your TX contact. So you can basically control, you know, basically by the knob on top of the radio, which, you know, channel you're in, and just pressing the button is automatically going to create either a group call or a specific call. The next one is going to be receive groups. Receive groups are sort of the ability for you to come in and say, I want to listen to 5 or 6 talk groups at a time on a given channel. And you can set this up instead of scanning your radio, which might take a little bit of time between each one. I can just pass all sorts of them. So I have my radio set up, so it's going to pass everything on time slot 1 and everything on time slot 2 that I have programmed in my radio, so that then that way if I hear someone calling on local, I can turn my knob, get onto local, and call them back. So that's sort of the way to do it instead of scanning. Because you could have a conversation going on local, and if your radio is programmed to Southeastern, you'll never hear it. Go ahead.
While I was on vacation, I had my DStar radio plugged in, and the chit-chat about DMR, it's a nice system, but again, it's hard to program Because there's a lot of stuff you have to remember.
Yes,
Then you get used to it.
it does have a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
But a lot of digital modes do. They just might hide it some way. So the operational courtesy of using DMR, the sort of the practical side of it, is that you need to identify with your call sign verbally. DMR doesn't, its ID does not count. The number does not map back to you necessarily. So you have to identify verbally per FCC rules. When you're on a wide area talk group, you want to keep things short. For instance, if you're talking worldwide, it's not nice to consume every repeater in the world for 20 minutes. You should probably be mindful that other people might want to call their friend in another country and say hi to them. There are talk groups that are worldwide but are push to talk or not as commonly used, and usually you might start a QSO on worldwide and then QSY to one of those talk groups. Personal calls are not really in the spirit of amateur radio. They're doable. You can also send text messages over DMR, but sort of keep them to a minimum because you are tying up a repeater in a time slot to talk to someone else, or potentially somewhere else on another repeater with in their time slot. So it is sort of a finite resource. It's a little bit more than other digital systems, but definitely is still a finite resource. And like I said, it's common to multiple talk groups at the same time instead of having like a scan function. So when you hop on, say this is KK4LWR on local 9. Don't just say KK4LWR, because if someone hears you, they're going to be like, okay, I'm listening to 5 talk groups. What are you on? I'm not going to be able to respond to you. But if you say on local 9 or on worldwide or on North America, people can at least come back to you and switch their radio to that dial and say, hey, how you doing? So I'm getting to the end of the presentation here. I got 3 slides left. Sort of what are the big advantages of DMR? There's a huge network of DMR users. There's 2,000 worldwide repeaters. There's over 1,000 DMR users in the state of Florida when I last checked. You have these always-on talk groups that really mean that there's a lot of activity. So if you're a new ham and you just want to listen, it's a great way to turn on a radio and you're pretty much going to hear something all day. There can be sometimes some really, really funny arguments. I heard about Canada invading the US one weekend on DMR, just listening to the North America talk group, and 2 people were getting frustrated about something and that sort of thing. And it was, without having to worry about setting up an HF rig, I could get people all around the world. They are relatively inexpensive compared to the competitors. The cheapest new DStar radios over $300, same with System Fusion. DMR, you're about $120 for the super cheap Titera. If you go to the Connect systems, it's at least Part 90 accepted, you're talking $240. And lastly, that TDMA technology is really popular. The fact that 2 people can be using it at the same time without colliding with each other. Because that's really something where you either have 5 repeaters in your town so that everyone can be on their own at the same time, or you sort of have to have this technology to sort of allow more users. So what are the disadvantages? The first is that you have to register for this ID number and it can take time. The second is that it is complicated to program. There's a huge learning curve, as Bob mentioned, to this, and you got to figure out that programming software or use one of the ones that are already available. If you go to gatorradio.org, you will pull one down and it will say, open up your CPS, change your call sign in this field, and put your ID number in this field, and then hit program, and it will do the rest for you. And your radio will be good to go. So it can be complicated to program, but there are tools out there to sort of overcome that. And it's reasonably up to date in terms of the contacts in the talk groups and all that. Those do change over time. But you have to remember that this is designed around like a consumer sort of commercial system. It's not designed for amateur radio. It's definitely something that's been adapted, which is sort of cool. It's very much a throwback to the way original amateur radio functioned, but it means it also comes with some features that we can't use. For instance, it can actually do GPS tracking. And a lot of the Motorola radios and higher end radios will have built-in GPSs. Unfortunately, because it doesn't append a call sign to the packets, we can't use them on the network because it is not identifying every 10 minutes. So it doesn't meet those requirements for amateur use. So there are a few things like that that you can sort of play around with, but keep in mind that they aren't necessarily legal for amateurs to use, or you'll need to come up with your own way to make it legal. I suppose that if you transmit your location on time slot 2 every 5 minutes, and you also hop on right afterwards and identify with your call sign, you could be legally meeting your requirement, but it's not like DStar where you can just sort of log your location, or System Fusion where you can see a location pop up. So some final conclusions. Digital voice is growing regardless of sort of which field you're in. And it's something that I think every amateur should at least try. Doesn't mean you have to start investing in it, but at least give it a shot. It really does sound much clearer than traditional AM or FM audio. Battery life is a lot better, that sort of thing. So at least give it a try, and it really is growing, especially among younger hams. There are technical differences between these different technologies that are so minute, but yet 100% incompatible. And hopefully this gave you sort of a bit of what I'm talking about when I say that. And lastly, DMR is sort of that low-cost entry into digital voice, and because it has some of those more commercial-grade, features like TDMA, it really sort of opens up more people to get on the air and get talking. So that's it for me. So if you have any questions, yeah.
The programming software, I'll bet, is only Windows?
Yes. I haven't tried it in Wine yet, but yes, it's only Windows. Again, it's designed for the commercial market. Any other questions? Yeah.
Since the digital voice and digital repeaters have been around 10 plus years now, and it's kind of been slow to get there, what do you really see as the benefit of digital over analog? Or is it just something, analog's going to be here for a long time and digital is just kind of like a side thing?
I don't think analog will ever die. The big thing that's pushed digital in the sort of more commercial side is that the government has mandated that you go to a 12.5 kilohertz bandwidth or less. Amateur radio obviously doesn't have that requirement, so there's less of that motivation to do that. I think what sort of motivated, at least more recently, the sort of uptick in DV is definitely the younger generation starting to play with these technologies and really starting to experiment again, because this is something that's very, very cool to play with. I can send a DMR packet through my radio that doesn't necessarily have to be voice, can be a whole bunch of different things. Being that sort of open standard is sort of cool to play with. As we're FM, you're sort of limited as to what you can do. Once you have a modem, it's pretty much set for you. So I think that's why it's starting to grow now, and I think that's the appeal of it.
How do you get your laptop hooked up to your radio to send your data?
So currently, with the radio that I have here, there's no way of doing it. On the Motorola radios, though, there's actually a full data port on the back. And you can program it over USB sort of thing on there. This one plugs into the headphone jack. But on the Motorola ones, there's a full data port on the back that you can send stuff over that. So I've never actually done it, but it is conceivable that you can do that. So, yeah?
If the repeater loses the internet in a disaster, what happens then?
So if the repeater loses the internet, it will turn into a local repeater. So you will hear everything, local. That will, on both time slots, will become local. The way that we have it set up here in Gainesville, we actually partnered with Shanscare to actually set up this repeater. So it is in their radio room, and it's on emergency power and on the redundant internet supply for the hospital. So the chances of our repeater going down are minimal, just because it's on the UF backbone, it's got redundant power. But if it does fail, it will become a local system. Yeah?
You mentioned it being limited to about 50 miles. Something to do with timing? Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Yes. So light travels at a certain speed, and essentially there's a 3-ish millisecond, 2.5 to 3 millisecond synchronization gap, and light can only travel about 50 miles in that gap to synchronize things. So
you get out there near the edge of that limit, and you then begin to get problems, perhaps multipath, things that they call latency issues, and it's a garbled mess.
Yes. Now you can hear everything just fine. You're going to hear your radio can receive. It's when you go to transmit, you and the repeater are going to be slightly off in time, and
so
you're
it's a time synchronization problem.
So I said all that to get to this. These problems, are they going to be exacerbated in mountainous or uneven or urban canyons?
I would say no, given the digital nature and the forward error correction. So if DMR receives a bad packet, and having played with it, I can get up to about 20 to 25% packet loss, which means 1 in every 4 packets is lost, and still be able to carry on a conversation and not notice it on my end.
Yeah, I thought you said they didn't have forward error control.
No, DMR has forward error control, DStar does not. So that's one of the big advantages of DMR and system fusion over DStar.
Yeah, as a curiosity, and Larry's not here, the New York Fire Department has completely canned digital they use analog around 440 because it's more reliable for them to be able to communicate in those conditions. Of course, they're also wearing breathers and they have special problems like that.
And I mean, you do still have the digital cliff with any of your DV. So if you're not familiar with that, because it's a digital packet, at some point, especially without forward error correction, you're just going to hear a little bit of garbling, and then it's just going to be gone. As where in FM, you'll sort of hear it fade as you go out further.
I know where he's come from with Larry's talking about buildings. The steel in them, it creates a Faraday cage.
Yep.
A grounded Faraday cage. Those high frequency radios don't get out.
So the thing is that this is UHF, just like a lot of the commercial radios. So both FM and DMR would have the same potential problems in that case, in terms of the Faraday cageness of the system.
Yeah, but the UHF is, the regular analog isn't quite as, it's a little wider band.
Nope. Actually, for commercial radios, they have to be the same bandwidth requirements. So 12.5 kilohertz is the federal regulated requirement for for commercial radios. So in that case, for amateurs, yes, we have 25 kilohertz. We can put a bit more out, slightly less efficient, but we can do it. In the commercial stuff, though, regardless if you're digital or analog, you have to be narrowband FM.
So are they trying, they can't do analog at that narrow of a bandwidth, or you just can't do
You
full
can,
analog?
and all of these radios can do both the cheap Chinese ones can. The Motorola, you have to get a special exemption to say that you're licensed to transmit wideband FM, but they can do FM, just like a DStar radio can do FM, just like a System Fusion radio can do FM. So you can still get all of the sort of traditional features. The only downside is that a lot of the DMR radios are single band. So mine is UHF from 403 to 470 megahertz, and that's it. Because that's all, that it's a commercial designed radio. That's in that space, they're all they're ever going to use. So, yeah?
Why is it important to have radios and digitals?
So the digital sort of revolution has come from the requirement of the government to go to narrowband FM. Narrowband FM voice does not travel as well and does not sound as good. As we're digital, you get sort of the benefits of having a sort of digitized signal. The other sort of big advantage to digital is the efficiency gained, especially in something like the DMR radios. Because of that sort of time slot, oscillation, you sort of have this nice ability that you're not always transmitting and always receiving. You're sort of transmitting at 50% duty cycle. And if we go back to the plots, we're staying on the unit circle, so we have maximum power transfer. We're not wasting energy with phase issues and stuff like that. So from a battery standpoint as well. Motorola advertises 50% better battery life with their DMR stuff versus their regular commercial FM. But again, that sort of goes down to, it's very hard to measure that in the practical sense. So those are sort of the big reasons why. But the biggest one is obviously that the government has sort of required everyone to go narrowband. Who isn't a ham? If you're a ham, you can. But yeah.
So I guess all of these digital radios of whatever type of technology have kind of a built-in terminal node controller, right?
Yes and no. It's controlled oscillation. Rather than having a TNC where you're actually transmitting and converting sort of the entire spectrum of available audio, these have sort of pre-programmed frequencies that they're gonna, basically oscillate at. And you have sort of, the modulator is gonna say this is either gonna be 1200 or 1800 hertz, depending on if it's a 0 or a 1. There's no actual, translation beyond that. So,
But what I was thinking is, it seems to me it would be completely natural to just have the radio set up so that I could send a bunch of digital data to it, and then it would just modulate the radio using whatever.
So that is very doable. The downside is that when you convert to baseband, you create new artifacts in your signal. So if you were to send a digital signal, or if you wanted to send an analog signal between these to like a TNC, and then convert it to something else, you sort of have inherent loss in that. You're having to go through a microphone and another sound interface to convert things. And that's sort of a disadvantage in terms of you could lose, quality and all that. It is doable in the traditional sense with a TNC, and you can do it with like a microphone in your computer. That sort of works, and actually the Northwest Digital interface for the The DR1X Yaesu repeaters uses that same concept to basically add DStar capabilities to those Yaesu repeaters by listening for that digital signal and then doing something with it. But again, you do have a sort of bit of a loss in that. So it is doable, but you're sort of trading off in terms of signal quality. So, yeah.
There's another benefit I see in the digital radios, which is intelligibility, and you touched on it.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to understand someone's voice. For instance, Bob there has got a voice, a gravelly male voice. Susan's got a female voice, and hers is more intelligible because of its use of the spectrum between 300 and 3,000 hertz. They take that, when they digitize it, slice it into 5 or so pieces, and they discover that slice 3 is more important for intelligibility. So that one is pre-emphasized. They also are able to clip it so that it's all equally loud. It's the reason that you can hear a tiny little voice on someone's cell phone across the room and understand every word. There's been some good science in that. All of that's done in the vocoder. I mean, analog digital conversion, digital analog conversion doesn't do anything, but the vocoder is where mathematical specifications are used to maximize this intelligibility. It's wonderful stuff.
Yep, it really is quite wonderful in terms of the quality of audio you get out. Yeah.
Do any of these have the like a stored voice record, so that if you hear something and you missed it and you want to go back and play it again so that you can catch what you missed? Like digital should be great for recording this type of stuff.
So not on DMR. There's no way that you can record and store this. I mean, you could if you were looking at the packets coming through, but if you're not, there's no way other than baseband, just like an audio recorder like what I have. On Yaesu Fusion, I know you can log into a room and send a recorded message that it will store up there for a period of time. I don't know if that's possible on DStar.
But just from the sense of, if, like you were saying, you give your call sign out and you're scanning, you miss it, can you go back and see what the last thing it received was, because it's digital? So it knows what it was, it just throws that information away because it flies by just like people talking.
So you could, and actually that's one of the cool things about the Titera MD380 is that someone reverse engineered the firmware. Essentially the Chinese company neglected to, do anything special with the firmware and pretty much took the stock stuff from ST Micro, which is the microcontroller in there, and used their same interface and USB drivers and all that jazz. So people got intelligent to this and went online and sort of reverse engineered that. So you could add that sort of feature into it, but it's not something that's inherently there. But that could be a radio added feature, yes. Again, DMR being commercially focused, it hasn't had those sorts of requests. But as this sort of picks up traction, there are ham radio friendly Motorola dealers, which, if you looked 5-10 years ago, you couldn't go off and buy a single Motorola radio. You had to go buy a complete solution. So those are sort of, the tides are changing. But again, amateur radio, though, is by no means a lot of volume for these companies. So you're sort of competing with that. And that's sort of goes to why DStar and System Fusion are the prices they are.
I've only seen it in the pagers where on a stored voice pager, when the tone goes off for you, it's usually a 30-second announcement saying, respond to address 2315 Northwest, whatever. And so you can play that again if you missed it. Whereas on the radio, they just say, repeat, and the dispatcher just tells them again. So, there's not a whole, if you go back and play back what you just missed, you might miss what's coming. So it's probably not.
I mean, it will flash across the screen with like the ID or the talk group that's currently active, but it only lasts for a couple of seconds after the transmission stops. It'll be there the entire time the transmission's going. So like that data is there and could be captured.
So sort of like your cell phone, you can do the call history and see who called you and your text messages, things like that. You would think your radio could have the same log.
So it sounds like you should go join the open source project and add that to, So, any other questions?
Are we using that VHF antenna still?
No, we are now on a UHF antenna that's 200 feet or so in the air. So that's been the big increase in area. And I have my radio here, and after the meeting, if you want to catch me out front, I'll key up DMR and talk about that. And if you want to rewatch what I just gave, I have the audio. I have the first 20 minutes on that camera and hopefully the rest of it on the GoPro. And I'll edit in the slides so they're a little bit easier to see as well. And I'll put that up on YouTube so you guys can catch that. So.
Thank you, Andy. Very good.